So this story originally started by me helping a friend framing a few walls under his back deck for extra storage. But he didn't know what kind of door he wanted, so I mentioned the possibility of using a barn door and he absolutely loved the idea. So then I had to build one. And I'll admit, before this, I had never built a barn door before. And he just so happened to have some extra 2x6 cedar boards lying around, so I gathered the ones that weren't boat material, got a sheet of birch plywood and headed back to my shop to build my first barn door. I began by cutting the lumber down to size for the rails and stiles, remembering to leave enough extra room on the ends of the stiles to later cut out for the tenons. Then I ran one edge through the jointer and then used the table saw to rip them to their final width of I think it was 5 inches. Then I needed to cut a groove for the panels to slide into. So I set up my dado stack to cut a 1/2 inch groove and used my fancy blue setup blocks to adjust the depth of my dado stack to 3/4 of an inch, and then set the table saw fence to a 1/2 inch, which according to my calculations should put the groove right in the middle of the middle of my door. Sheesh, that would be bad. With the table saw set up, I can then run one edge of the top and bottom rails through the dado and both edges of the middle rail, since it will have a panel on both sides of it. With the rails cut, I can then move on to the stiles. But because I don't want those unsightly holes in the end of the door, I will be doing a plunge cut. So I marked both the start and stop points on the stiles and on my table saw. Then I slowly lowered the board down on my mark and ran it through, making sure to stop the table saw on my line. And with all the grooves cut for the panels to slide into, it was time to cut the tenons on the rails. And since the table saw already had the dado stack in it, I adjusted the height to a 1/2 inch and began cutting each of them. Once those were done, I then measured the location of the tenons and marked the stiles where the mortises were going to be. And to cut the mortises, I used a specialized tool made by Jet that I got from a garage sale. And this is the first time that I had a chance to use it. And after using it, I'd have to say that it was a huge time saver, at least on this softer cedar wood. It only took about 20 minutes to cut all 6 of my mortises for this project. I did, however, have to clean up the mortises a bit with a chisel, but overall, it worked pretty well. After making a few adjustments on the tenons, I can finally introduce the tenons to my newly formed mortises for the first time. And I have to say, they were like 2 peas in a pod, like peas and carrots. Then, to make sure everything was going to line up like it was supposed to, I went ahead and assembled the framing, and if it don't fit, get a bigger hammer. No, don't really, you might damage the wood. While it was assembled, I thought this was a good time to bring out the sander with some 120 grit paper and sand the faces, particularly the joint areas, to make sure they were flat with each other. Then I disassembled the framing and sanded the inside edges because after I assemble this door, it will take forever to sand this little edge on both sides of the door by hand. Then I grabbed my handheld router and with a 45-degree chamfer bit, I started hitting all of the inside edges of the rails and stiles. The reason I did this while it was all pulled apart is because I wanted that chamfer to continue through the joints because I thought it would look nice. A trick I learned when routing the end grain is when you get to the corner is to stop and slowly go backward around the corner. This will help reduce the chance of tear out, but does not eliminate it. With that done, I then needed to cut out the panels, and I decided it was best to use a track saw for this, but since I didn't have one, I just used my straight edge saw guide and used my circular saw. Honestly, I've been making cuts like this for years. It's a pain in the tuchus to set up, but it does the job. And as you can see, I sanded the panels before I began applying glue to the mortise and tenons. Now, I definitely felt a little rushed in this part of the build because it's just me in the shop, and I needed to get everything assembled before the glue started to set up too much. So after I got one side glued together, I slid in both panels, and I'm really glad they fit because I totally spaced pre-assembling everything before gluing things together, and that could have ended badly. Hey, if you made it this far in the video, consider hitting that like and subscribe button, and I read all of the comments. So start off your comment with the word potato so I know you watched it. Okay. Next, I installed the remaining stile with some more glue, and then used these pipe clamps to help pull it together and hold everything tight until the glue dries. Then I measured corner to corner to make sure everything was square. While the glue dries, I figured this was a good time to fill some knot holes and some other blemishes. So I took some of the sanding dust and mixed it with some glue, then pressed it into the cracks to help stabilize them. Then once it dries, I can sand it down and it looks a lot better. On darker woods, I'd recommend using a clear wood glue, but I figured with the color of this wood, it won't make much difference. Once everything is dry and out of the clamps, I took my router and added the same 45-degree chamfer around the outside of the door, and it was ready for paint.